Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Unrank, the first Jurors. In this video, I'm only talking about the sequestered jury of Big Brother USA. So I'm not discussing Big Brother 3 or Big Brother 2, I'm not discussing Big Brother Canada, and I'm not discussing the spin-off shows. Since this week we will have our first juror, and as I'm recording this, which is on Sunday, I figured I'd have some time to discuss and think about the games of the first jurors. Obviously, since they are first jurors, not a lot of them played great games. So if someone is high or if someone's medium and they're bad players, that's why. So I'm going to get this person out of the way. At 19th and at dead last is Cody Nixon from Big Brother 19. Out of all the first jurors, he needed the most extensive help to get him there to begin with. He won HOH in the first week, and this is usually good for most people, since you set the momentum of your season when you win the first HOH, and you have a better chance of getting into a dominant majority alliance that will run the season. Cody outright decides to blow this by attempting to nominate one ally, Paul, nominating another ally, Christmas, and blindsiding his entire alliance, even the woman who would become his wife, Jessica. Outside of that move, his personality just got on everyone's nerves, and the entire house decides to throw the next HOH competition to Paul, just so he can get Cody out via a backdoor, which happens flawlessly. Cody is out in week 2, and luckily for him, there was a buyback competition, so it allowed him to come back during the 4th week. Obviously, he would not be on this list if the opportunity wasn't there to begin with. So, Jessica wins HOH in that week, and when she has this gut feeling of vetoing Ramses, Cody decides that she shouldn't do it, and he convinces her not to veto her. They are both blindsided when their pawn Ramses goes home over Josh, their target. Paul wins HOH in the next week, and throw Cody and Jessica right up on that block, since she let it be known that she has the halting hex. Despite the house trying to get her to not use it, Jessica uses the hex, which causes the pre-jury to be extended for another week, and an immunity competition causes an opportunity for people to stay immune, which Cody won in week 6, earning him a spot in jury. His only ally Jessica goes that week, and he's a sitting duck for the next week, as Alex gets rid of him, which the entire house but Mark and Elena wants. So he was already booted pre-jury, was lucky to have the battle back, and needed 2 more twists to make it to jury when he was a target during those initial weeks where he came back, even over Jessica. I'm not even going to mention his horrible social game and strategic game, which rightfully earned him a last place spot here. At 18, I have Brendon. Brendon is another one who needed twists to get him to jury, and was the only other person who was evicted on this list before the jury phase. So he is one of the 6 veterans that came in, and since that season was about pairs, him and fiancé at the time Rachel were obviously a pair. She was able to win the first HOH, which caused all of them to set up a solid alliance with the solid vets, and were able to get a few additional numbers from the newbies. At the same time, none of these additional numbers were brought in by Brendon, and he arguably had the worst social games with the newbies out of all the vets. Things kind of go for the course as Rachel wins another HOH, and their close ally Danielle is pushing for them to get rid of Jeff and Jordan, so they can have better in with the newbies. Brendon and Rachel are having relationship issues, and are also pissed off that the newbies like Jeff and Jordan more than them. Brendon wins the veto that week, and he of course decides not to use it, which pisses Danielle off. Regarding the house fight that happens at the end of the 3rd week, Brendon got it all started because of his condescending, rude attitude towards Kalia, when all she wanted to do was to generally make peace with him in that situation, which also ruined his otherwise good relationship with Danielle. Danielle wins HOH in the following week, and instead of targeting Jeff like she initially wanted to in the last week, she nominates Brendon for feeling betrayed and wanting Brendon specifically to go home. He wins the veto, and because he didn't really want to be in the house that summer, and knowing that it was Rachel's dream, he vetoes Rachel, knowing that he is going home. Luckily for him, there was a buyback competition, and with the way it was done and set up, 4 of the evicted house guests would have to deal with the vote, and Brendon had the biggest advantage, since he was a vet. So, he beats Lawan to get into the house, and Danielle has to get rid of him once again. So she backdoors him, and he is the first juror. Production also told the veterans that they were, quote-unquote, guaranteed jury, and this caused for them to show vitriol at any of the newbies that targeted them, so he had production on the side when his gameplay couldn't get him that far. So essentially, he is really only above Cody because he wasn't as horrible strategically and socially, and had a very solid alliance, though Brendon himself was arguably the most useless of that alliance. So, at 17th is Ashley from Big Brother 14. I am not going to waste much words on her, since there isn't much words to say about her, especially regarding Ashley's game. She was a part of Janelle's team, and it didn't seem like any of the power players wanted to work with them or deal with them, so they all were kind of outcasts. Ashley didn't think about strategy whatsoever throughout the season, and she wasn't good in competitions or involved in any alliances really. While I don't think she was bad socially, she wasn't great either. She was just ditzy, and some people were amused, annoyed, or neutral towards it. I remember her being nominated in the third week as a pawn, as Shane wanted to backdoor Frank, who she was becoming somewhat close to at this time. I remember that the show tried to push her and Ian as some sort of thing, but her and Frank kind of hooked up during his HOH, so everyone knew that she was close to Frank. Ultimately, this was her undoing, as she was nominated against Frank in the double, and he of course won veto, so she was booted. Ashley just had no place whatsoever in the game regarding any capacity, but unlike the other two, Ashley got to jury on her own merits and was never evicted beforehand. At 16th, I have Jocasta. So, there really isn't much or any difference between Jocasta and Ashley, and they are both relatively interchangeable on this list. Jocasta was not in the majority alliance or had many relationships with many people in the house, but she seemed relatively harmless compared to some of the others. From what I remembered, she was close to Donnie, which was the case throughout the entire season, and she actually had somewhat of a bond with a lot of the earlier house guests that were booted before her. She was very unthreatening to everyone, but was expendable to everyone as well, which is why she was a pawn for 4 out of the 6 weeks she was in the house for, which was especially heightened when the Battle of the Block twist caused for more nominations. She did make it to jury on her own merits, but she never really actively played, and her expendability ended up being her downfall, when she was sent home over Zach in the last minute, due to the majority alliance wanting to keep their majority. She seemed a bit smarter than Ashley, so here she is, one spot above. At 15, I have Rachel. As we all know, Rachel got very close with Brendon, her future husband, to the point where she actively alienated everyone else, and even shunned Annie, who wanted to work with them. She was nominated against Brendon in the first week, though she was never the target, since everyone thought he or Annie was the saboteur. So when Brendon vetoed himself, she was never in danger of going home, and Annie was unanimously evicted. Despite this, her personality annoyed people a lot, and many wanted to see her out the door sooner than later. Rachel ends up winning HOH to target Monet and nominate her best friend Brittany on the block, instead of the man who nominated her last week, in Hayden. Matt ends up being the pawn after he volunteers himself to be in Brittany's place, and she has a successful HOH, though she gets into a few unnecessary fights during the week, which turns people against her even more. Matt wins the next HOH, and she isn't in danger at all, as he wanted Brendon backdoored, and not her, and even Brendon's backdoor doesn't happen, because he wins the veto. But overall, Rachel does nothing to improve her position in the house at all during this week. She then wins HOH again, and blatantly attacks Kristen and Hayden in front of everyone, which rubs people the wrong way, but with the couple remaining on the block, Rachel gets her target out of the house. The target between her and Brendon only shifts towards her during her final week, due to winning her second consecutive HOH, and she does not handle being on the block against Brendon well at all. She does get into a few arguments with Rickon, but as the week goes on, her and Brendon hatches a plan where Brendon will act up to the point where everyone will send him home, and for Rachel to try to integrate herself with the other house guests. But everyone saw through it, and Rachel was still evicted, which just shows how poorly she played. Ultimately, she didn't use her HOHs to secure any deals or alliances, and her personality made her position even worse. At 14th is Marcellas. So, Marcellas entered Big Brother 7 with no solid allies, from what I could remember, but he did kiss up to Big Brother 6 during the first few weeks, as he became close friends with Janelle and built a bond with Kaysar. Despite warning Danielle out of the house for how she did him in their first season, they end up making up and building a close relationship throughout the season. He got along with most of the girls, like Erica and Diane, and was a part of the quote-unquote floater group. But outside of that, his social game was pretty awful, as most of the guys could not stand him in the house. Of course, there was the fight with Jace, and Marcellas using it to send Jace home when a flip was in the works to boot well. Him and Howie did not get along at all throughout the season, and of course he made it known how much he did not like Chilton at all. And Chilton were the people who were in power the entire season, so that wasn't good for Marcellas. And he didn't have the allies to take Chilton out. He also started trashing Janelle to anyone who would listen, and this would all get back to Janelle. So, he was lowering his capital with everyone in the house, and wasn't even winning competitions or being strategic like he was in his last season. A lot of people wanted him out during the pre-jury, and if it wasn't for Danielle refusing to nominate him on her HOH, he would have been the last pre-juror. Chilton convinced Janelle to nominate him as a pawn against Erica, but the entire house, even Marcellas, knew he was a gunner. He played very poorly this season, and if it wasn't like he was an active player, winning competitions, was heavy in strategy, or was great socially either. At 13, I have Ian. Out of everyone who competed on Big Brother All-Stars 2, or Big Brother 22, I always forget about him the most. His game reminds me a lot of Marcellas' game in All-Stars, who I just spoke about. Like the former, he also had a lot of unearned arrogance, thought he was better than everyone else, and thought that he had a much better grasp of the game than he did, while just being very poor socially. It did seem like he was getting kind of close to Kaysar, who he saw as an intellectual equal, but none of that was used to make an official allegiance. It seemed like he only aligned with Nicole throughout the season, as they were the only two winners on the cast. A lot of people saw him as expendable, and there was a set of people that were actively targeting for him to go home sooner rather than later. Ian did not have competitions to propel him like he did in Big Brother 14, and while he was nominated on Danielle's HOH as a result of David's twist saving David, and the veto being used by Devon, it did show how expendable he was, and he did not handle the block well whatsoever. I also remember him whining and complaining about how he didn't want to campaign to those people, whatever the F that meant, and he was a snob towards the people that wanted to save him. If anything, this season revealed that without twists and comps, Ian is just not good. So at 12th, I placed Dana. So Dana is the first sequestered juror ever, and she surely set the standard for the messiness that a first juror tends to have, from a character and entertainment point of view. Because she was one of the 3 people who did not have an ex in the house, it put her in a good position, since there's no emotional baggage for her. She was a part of the original 8 alliance, but it seemed like she was closer to Allison, Nathan, and especially June. But it became clear to everyone that she was very close with Dustin, who was on the other alliance, and she admitted that she was playing both sides. Her allies then tried to throw her under the bus to send her home in the next week, once the Stooges won power, but G stops it because he wants his plan to be executed, and his allies could use Dana for the future. Of course, all of this gets back to Dana, and as she wins HOH the next week, she nominates Allison and Jack, 2 former allies, and she didn't want to alienate Nathan by putting him up beside Allison. Everyone sees this as a jealousy move, since Justin, who was Allison's ex and is Dana's showman, told her about everything. It gets even worse for her when she sees Nathan veto Allison, forcing her to send David home. No one in the house trusts her, and her idea of having her and Jen align with the Stooges is a good idea, but her social game was not strong enough to pull it off, and they didn't trust her, hence her going home unanimously in the following week. Though, you could say that she would have been safe if anyone else but Allison won HOH, she would have been safe. At 11, I have Bayleigh. Like Dana, she and a few other people that I'm going to eventually discuss in the list were in a very good position at the start of the season, and things went wrong for her, despite that good positionality. In the beginning, she was actually pretty close with the level 6 side of the house, but once she got into a showmance with Swaggy, her future husband, and he was evicted, she felt like she was forced to stick with what would become the Hive Alliance, so she did hold some resentment towards them for a while. Even despite that, she got close to all of the people within that alliance and became the de facto leader of that alliance, while the level 6 side had absolutely no reason to target her and weren't planning on targeting her anytime soon. Things completely fell apart when she won HOH, because her attitude and bossiness got 100% worse. She cut people off and made people feel like crap. And the worst of it being is that she told Rachel about having the power app, where I think she only told Faisal about it beforehand. Of course, Rachel tells her entire alliance, and they now want to boot Bayleigh next. Bayleigh is targeting Brett on her HOH, but her pawn Rachel ends up going home, which caused her to stomp around the house in a pissed off mood, accusing a bunch of people on flipping the votes even when they didn't, mainly her allies, and she's backdoored, which she does not handle well at all. At 10th, I have Jennifer. From what I remember about Jennifer in the first week, is that she was actually in a very bad spot, and there was a discussion of Rachel backdooring her, since she was rubbing people the wrong way, especially with her flirting of the guys. Ultimately, nothing comes of it, and it gives her some time to get into a solid alliance with the friendship, and to be better situated with the opposite alliance compared to her allies. Jennifer was actually very under the radar for a majority of the pre-jury phase, and her partner April was also helping her maneuver throughout the season, and the strategy actually worked. Maggie, Yvette, and Eric were always bigger targets compared to her, and she was not even in discussion to be sent home. Ultimately, things go to hell for her once she wins HOH, and promises Kaysar that she would not nominate his allies initially, and that she will backdoor James. So she breaks the first part by nominating Janelle and Rachel, and I understand why she did that, because nominating her allies could have went wrong, since her alliance would not have controlled the vote for that week. Because her allies decided to want Kaysar out, she decides to take the bullet, knowing that it would cause her to be evicted almost immediately after, which kind of makes it even worse on her part, especially that she was knowing that this would happen. Honestly, she should have just backdoored James, which would put her in a good position with the entire house, and she could go back under the radar, but she played too much of a team game and put a bright target on herself for very little reason. In number 9, I have Devon. Wow! I am actually very shocked that she made it into the top half of this list, but remember this, it is about first jurors, and most of them do not play well in general. Let me just get into her game on Big Brother 18. So she was brought into the majority alliance, but also had good enough relations with the Josiah, Paul, and Victor side of the house, as they wanted her to vote with them. This is a great spot for her to be in during the first week, though I do question how quick she was to throw Josiah under the bus, when that would have been a number for her down the line. Within that majority, a girls' alliance was formed with her, Zakia, Nicole, Michelle, and Tiffany, but Devon was the main one who spread a bunch of paranoia between the women, and that was ruined just as quickly as it started. So the mess with her, Tiffany, and Frank brought a lot of unnecessary attention on her, and it made her target grow exponentially, especially as some of her lies got exposed, like Devon telling Frank that Tiffany wanted to start another girls' alliance with the Spy Girls, and he exposed it after the house flipped on him with booting Bront. Tiffany realized that Devon cannot be trusted and started gunning for her hardcore. Even despite all of that, she's offered to join an alliance with Nicole, Corey, Polly, and Zakia, which she rejected, though it would have put her in a good position. Instead of aligning with the showmances, who would always be a target over her, she was planning on targeting them, which eventually got back to Polly, who orchestrated her demise to become the first jury member. Unlike many of the others, she finds herself in good positions and can be perceptive, at least in this season, but she's too messy, impatient, and paranoid to make anything of it. At number 8, I have Candice. It is really hard to talk about Candice and her game, especially with how blatant racism got in the way of it throughout the season. She found herself to be nominated against Jessie by McQuaid in the first week, but she was never the target, and McQuaid took her off the block with the veto. It seemed like she had good relationships with the likes of Alyssa, Helen, Amanda, Jessie, Andy, and that side of the house, though she did have a lot of haters, like Gina Marie especially, Aaron, Caitlin, Jeremy, David, and that side of the house. Candice was very perceptive, as she was the first person to notice that there was a guys' alliance and listed everyone who was a part of it. Of course, we had the fight in the bed, and then things just spiraled out of control due to all the racism that was taking place in the house. Her and Howard were then isolated from everyone else, and everyone ratted her out, which caused her to be the target. This happened after she tried to flip the votes on Amanda in week 5, once her, Howie, and Amanda were on the block. Anyways, this target on her grows a lot as Gina Marie wins the HOH, and Jessie, who the house would have sent home instead, wins the veto. Of course, during her eviction week, she got into a lot of arguments, which was just uncomfortable to watch. Candice is perceptive, but she was never able to gain any real power within the house to use it to her best ability. So at 7th, I have Dustin. From my memory, it was Joe who was the huge superfan out of him and Dustin, but the house liked Dustin more instead. Of course, they had their drama throughout the first week, but then Joe was evicted in the second week, which definitely helped Dustin out. He was able to get into the majority alliance, which was the late night Jamboree alliance, and they did run the entire pre-jury portion of the season. You did start to see cracks once he won HOH, as he became very bossy and big-headed, with a selfish side to him being revealed during the veto competition, where he took a majority of the prizes. This caused people to start seeing him in a different way, but no one was going to target him due to it. So he sent home Nick on his HOH, which was a good move, as it weakened the Donatos, brought Amber closer to him, and it was something his majority alliance wanted. Of course, there was the failed flip during week 5 on the Donatos' part, which kept Eric in over Kale, which was what Dustin and his alliance wanted. Jessica wins the next HOH, and he's supposed to be safe, but America's player is told to target and send Dustin home for eviction. Even without that though, which is where I judge him, he volunteers to be a pawn, which is never a good thing to do. And there is a chance he would have made it a lot further had he not done this. But at the same time, he is only sent home at the final 9 because America controlled Eric's vote, and he had to campaign for Dustin to go, because Derek was liked by the country. Eric has since admitted that he never would have targeted Dustin in this round or anytime soon, had it been his own choice. So I am placing Matt at 6th. I feel so weird about putting Matt this high, not only because of the stuff he did outside of the house, but because his season was such an absolutely messy cluster F, as well as his game, to be quite honest. So we get into the first week, and him and Natalie are aligned with Amanda and Alex, who are HOH, and Parker and Jen, who are the power couple in the first few days. You would assume that they all have a good chance to run things, since they were all good at competitions. But the latter are nominated, he and Natalie win the veto, don't use it, and they end up sending Parker and Jen home. Due to being so close to Amanda and Alex, him and Natalie are nominated beside them, and they almost go home. Luckily, the trigger isn't pulled, and he's put in the middle during the third week, as he is potentially the swing vote, and promising everyone that he is keeping them safe. But the issue is, everyone sees through it. Week 4 takes place, and there is a plan to backdoor him, despite trying to form a guys' alliance. Ryan seems like he would cave to do it, but luckily, Sheila convinces Ryan not to do it, but Matt didn't even realize this was all happening. The house is divided at this point, and James comes back wanting to get revenge at the people who didn't vote to bring him back into the house. Matt decides to lie about it all week, but it's obvious he was the third vote, so James decides to nominate him post-veto. Shockingly, Matt is able to get 3 votes on his side, the entire side that would become T Christ to keep him. But the issue was getting that 4th vote. I think he showed a lot of great potential and wasn't really bad, but he was just a bit too sloppy with his moves, so he couldn't execute what he was trying to instill. At number 5 is Jack. I feel even weirder putting him up this high, and I hate putting him here, but he did play better than a lot of the first jurors, though that clearly doesn't say a lot. He ended up in a majority alliance called Grateful pretty quickly with Jackson, Annalise, Christy, Thomas, Nick, Holly, and Bella. I said Thomas, but honestly, who gives an F about BB21? I'm gonna keep it in the edit. So, they had control over the first few weeks, and he won HOH to target the one person who was targeting him in Kemi, though he cheated her wrong, and I didn't like that whole dynamic between the two of them, but that's besides the point. Bella and Nick got shady, so the alliance became an alliance of 6, which did not include them. While Cap comeback was happening, he demanded all of the house guests to not talk to anyone about any game with any of the evicted house guests. And while it was good for his game, it did show everyone that he clearly thought and knew that he was the king of the castle, and put a target on himself. Cliff ends up nominating him in the 4th week against Nick, which turned into Bella being sent home against him. I do remember he was a part of the reason as to why the 6 alliance ended, as he received some information from Jackson about Holly and Catherine. He told his alliance about it, and it caused that huge fight that blew up his entire alliance. Jessica ended up winning HOH and nominated him against Jackson, where because he was seen as the leader, he went home. He didn't make many mistakes compared to the others, but lacked nuance and didn't know much about the game clearly, which is why he ended up where he is. So at 4th, I have Libra. She's another one that I feel weird about putting up this high, since she was a huge target from almost the very beginning of the season. I will say that she was the main person who got the ball rolling on sending Brian home in week 1, as she and April spotted the alliance and called Ollie out directly, which led to all the falling domino pieces that ended up happening. I think due to that though, it caused a lot of people to see her as a threat, and it's even worse because she was not the best socially. She called out Keisha for trying to save Steven in front of everyone, which pissed Keisha off, as she got into a blow-up with Jerry and Rennie for the supposed "slow all people" comment she made during the have-not competition. But Jessie didn't want to take that shot yet. Steven was targeting her, and he got evicted. Keisha ends up winning the HOH the next week, and despite there being pressure to nominate her, Keisha refused to nominate Libra, and Angie, who was targeting Libra, ended up leaving. Luckily for her, April won the next HOH, and there's no consideration for targeting her, and after the cake fight, she was able to get her way to vote Jessie out, who was the most aggressive in targeting her. Ultimately, this came at the cost of losing 2 solid allies in April and Ollie. And once she lost the HOH comp to Michelle, it was over for her. She almost won the veto that week as well, but came short. April and Ollie did try to keep her, but they were not able to get the votes. Ultimately, she was strategic and very perceptive, but was a bit too overt with it, and didn't have a very good social game to make up for it, as she was kind of seen as expendable to many of the others. But she wasn't really messy with her gameplay, compared to some of the others I've already talked about. At number 3, I have Will. During Big Brother 5, Will found himself in a very good position. Of course, the girls wanted to work with him, which he was initially skeptical of, but he was recruited and became one of the key figures of what would become the Pinky Swear Alliance, which would be the alliance that had most of the numbers throughout the season. And outside of that, the opposing alliance, which is the Four Horsemen Alliance, was never targeting him and actively tried to recruit him as a number or someone they could potentially work with. So he had a decent enough relationship with them as well, despite him loathing them. It seemed like he knew what he was doing and tried not to anger anyone, as he saw the flaws in people like Diane regarding her gameplay at the time. I think his issue was that he wasn't good with threat management and was a bit too focused on the alliance instead of his own game. I also think that he let it be known that he didn't trust the twins that much and wanted them gone sooner than later, so they put him on the block as soon as they got the chance to. It is weird to talk about this week since there was some implied homophobia that was mentioned on the episodes. I don't know what else was going on in the feeds during that time. Though it could have been that Adria just didn't understand the optics of it all. But he didn't campaign for himself, he didn't even bother speaking to her, to even guilt her into using the veto on him, and honestly kind of folded. Also, we never really saw him in a position of power, really, compared to someone like Diane or even Nokomis, as a leader who took more power for themselves. Despite that, he caused the votes to go into a tie, so he had a strong team behind him. But people like Drew saw that he was a huge threat, so he was booted in 9th. In 2nd, I have Shelli. It makes sense that Shelli would be very high on the list of first jurors, as we actually saw her in power for most of the pre-jury, and how she handles being in power. So she was a part of the girls' alliance with Devon and Andre, which was formed on day 1, but as the first week went on, she realized how untrustworthy Devon was, and the latter made it clear that she did not like Shelli or Clay, who was Shelli's showmance. She was well liked by what would become the Goblin Alliance, and what would become the Sixth Sense Alliance, so she targeted Devon instead of Audrey, who was still the house target at the time, and no one really cared that much about her evicting Devon. She was in support of Jeff going home in the 3rd week, while having solid relationships with everyone. When she became in power again, which did build more of a target on her, she was planning on targeting Jason, but realized that Audrey was too much of a liability to keep around as a number and a shield, especially after the latter fought with Clay. You start to see the pattern with whoever fights with Clay ends up going home, especially when Shelli's in power. So, we get to week 5, where the Dark Moon fiasco happens, and she helps push the idea of getting rid of Jason over Austin, which does anger the Goblin Alliance, since they knew she and Clay were behind it, but wouldn't own up to it. As soon as she's out of power, Shelli kind of folds, isolates herself, and becomes an emotional train wreck. Luckily for her, Clay didn't want to be in sequester, and wasn't as close to the Sixth Sense, so he was booted over her. But Becky won HOH and nominated her as a pawn, while the other goblins were still mad at her, and her other allies saw her as a lot more expendable compared to Vanessa, which caused her to be sent home unanimously. Especially after stealing the shirt Clay gave to James, which I wish they put in the episode. So at number 1 is Jessie. I'm pretty sure that Jessie being number 1 was very obvious to many people, especially with the fact that under the normal gameplay of the week and without a twist, he would have made it further than being the first juror, and he didn't put himself in this position at all. But he was lucky that the HOH comp benefited the bronze, as he was the sole veteran that entered, causing people to gravitate towards him since he had more experience within the game, obviously. He aligned with Natalie and Russell, who helped him align with the Brains team, specifically Ronnie and Chima, while having extra numbers via Lydia and Kevin. He saw the opportunity to get rid of a potential threat in Brendon and took that shot successfully. Ronnie won HOH and didn't have to worry about being a target then, and he didn't care about the mess Ronnie got himself into, since Ronnie proved to be a loyal ally to Jessie and his alliance. Jessie wins HOH again and makes the smart move in not targeting Ronnie, since he was a good ally and the entire house was after him anyways. So he took this opportunity to get rid of Casey, which wasn't a bad move. Week 4 was where his game started tumbling in my opinion, since he made it clear that he did not want Ronnie to go home, and even voted for Ronnie to stay when he knew he didn't have the numbers. This did 2 things. It not only showed Russell that he chose Ronnie over him when Russell was staying in the house, but it shows to Lydia, who was the other nominee, and Kevin that he values Ronnie over the 2 of them, while those 2 were staying in the house and Ronnie wasn't. Week 5 should have been a safe week for him, since Chima won at HOH and she would have never targeted him, but he was fine with letting Russell go, which I don't think was the best move for him. Due to knowing about the cube, he tried to form a relationship with Jeff to keep himself safe, but it was too late, but Jessie shouldn't have even been in that position to begin with. So that is my list regarding how I rank the first jurors based off the game they played in their season. Since as I'm recording this, it looks like Brittany is going home, I would probably rank her around where I placed Marcellas and Ian, so around the early teens. Not high, but yeah. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I will speak to or see you, however the term you want to use, and I will be back soon.